Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Today we have Dave Bobb. He's a professional working actor who also runs classes on audition technique and scene study. Dave's been in Blue Bloods and Succession, along with a number of other TV shows and films. He also has a number of theater credits as well. Thanks so much for joining me today, Dave. I'm excited to do this interview.
Yes, you're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you get into acting, and what really like drew you to it, and what would you say are like one or two of your biggest accomplishments that you've had so far?
I think what drew me to it mostly was in school, in classes, being in a situation in which I was communicating with others and connecting with others in specific human ways, as opposed to sitting in a desk and memorizing information for multiple choice
Hmm.
question tests at a later period of time. I then got into it even more when I recognized I hadn't developed the social skills or the cues that basically led me to feel like I was able to share myself with others. And it was an opportunity to, should I get the part, with the lights down or with the lights on me and everybody watching me see me without me having to do that. And that was a little bit of a false feeling there of sharing who I was, especially in my formative years there where I wasn't really developed and didn't, so I was basically doing a bunch of things that were almost like antics and wasn't acting as I've recognized it needing to be, especially in on camera work where the camera catches everything.
Hmm.
And so you can't really get away with anything. And definitely antics just don't look like real reactive things that are happening in that moment. But it was definitely what fueled me to get into the work of acting theater wise. And then I developed my theater acting technique all the way up through my MFA program. And that ultimately led me to getting representation here in New York and starting my on camera TV and film career.
Awesome. And so, what would you say are like one or two of the biggest accomplishments that you're most proud of in your career so far?
Definitely booking a major motion picture, and in the setting that it was through improvisation, which was extremely helpful at the period of time in which I was getting into the TV and film world, because there was no script. It was a French director, Luc Besson,
Mhm.
and I basically recognized at that moment when I went into that room that, feelings aside of all the feelings that somebody can have when they're in an audition room looking around at people that they've seen on TV and film before, I just had this kind of connection of that I am, and I have just as much of a right to be here as anyone else. And I can bring myself to the context of this scene, which I was going to be getting at that moment, right? I didn't have the script ahead of time, which I'd had in some auditions previous to that when I was just starting to feel my way around. So I didn't have the awful luxury of preconceiving what I was going to do, of developing my agenda, all that kind of stuff, so that I could really just be free to bring my life to bear on that moment and embrace who I was. And it worked. And I was able to be present enough to really understand the world that he was describing that I was going to improv in. So I figured I knew what the context was. I could hear it, and then I just listened. The people that I was improvising with, I reacted. The things that they were saying, the things that they were doing, I had a direct relational effect to what those were. And that, I feel like, really helped me book that first major motion picture, which ended up being a scene opposite Robert De Niro, which was kind of surreal for that being my first experience on set.
Awesome. So yeah, I mean, it sounds like it's a lot about the improvisation and everything, and during the real audition. Just out of curiosity, like before the audition, we're going to talk a lot about audition soon. Before you got in there, uh, did you find that like talk a little bit about like any connections or like marketing things that you like, actually like steps that you took or anything to get to that point where you had the opportunity to do the audition?
Sure, that's a very good point. How I got representation was basically through a series of fortunate events, luckily, but not so luckily. I said yes to an audition while I was at my MFA program at the Shakespeare Theater Company in DC. And I wasn't meant to be auditioning in the midst of that program. It's a very intensive 1-year MFA where you're working 12 to 16 hours a day and being broken down and developing a toolkit and all the rest of it. But the audition was for a Shakespeare play, Richard III. And I was halfway through the program and I thought, what the hell, I'll break the rules, but apply everything I'm learning to this and just see where I'm at. And what was lovely about that was that I was not like ready. I think a lot of times in the past for myself, I felt like, wait a second, this needs to be perfect. I need to be ready. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so that saying yes garnered me a large role in Mary Stuart. And those rehearsals started the day after my MFA program ended, which could not have been better timing. A gentleman actor in our MFA program who got us a showcase up in New York to present our work from the MFA program. Representation came to see our showcase, saw my work there, both in classical and modern play. And then I was in communication with him based on that. He saw the great reviews from Mary Stuart in the Washington Post that I was in, and I was able to ultimately get an interview with him and get representation before I even moved up here. So through doing saying yes to a bunch of things and applying myself and working my butt off even to get into the MFA program, I was able to get representation without really knowing what TV and film acting was, which is what I got thrown into kind of in the deep end of the pool. So that's how it worked for me. Of course, that's not how it's going to work for everybody. Everybody has their own path, but readiness is all, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm. So I wrote down like two sort of follow-up notes to what you said there. One, talking about saying yes to opportunities. There's definitely some actors who I've spoken with who, for one reason or another, they don't want to say yes to certain projects. Like one actor feels like they're being sort of typecast into a role and they're not enjoying playing that role. Just from your perspective, I'm curious to hear, like, what would you say to an actor who, let's say they get offered a lot of different opportunities, but they're sort of like turning things down because they don't enjoy it? Do you feel like they should say yes to things, or they should always be open to saying yes? Or like, what would you just say if somebody had, asked that of you?
Definitely on the positive end to it, it's our responsibility to be able to apply our life to the roles that we get, and that there's kind of unlimited possibilities that can arise when we're just present to what we can offer that role, and how it could be, even if it's typecast, how it can lead to future opportunities, especially regarding networking when you're on set and meeting people and so on and so forth. And so it really is a personal situation, as everything is, that's dependent on where you are in your career. That being said, once you have done a certain level of whatever it might be, sometimes just saying no to something is telling the universe that you're ready for the next biggest thing. Mm-hmm. That being said, you want to be doing all the work that leads you to be ready for the next biggest thing.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. I mean, and in some cases, if you're normally willing, if you would normally say no to a project, but it's something that you like, you're not like morally against doing it. It's just that you don't really feel like it. There's definitely, at least in my opinion, room for you to start trying to negotiate a higher rate on those things. Like, all right, I'll do it if you're going to pay me $1,000 or something,
Sure, there's so many different things that can happen there. Yeah.
And the other question that I had written down while you were talking earlier was just in terms of, like, you had mentioned, being ready for something or having everything together perfectly. And sometimes actors feel like they're not ready yet to go out there and like apply for something or go out there and try to get a specific agent. And, maybe that's true, maybe it's not. Do you feel like in some cases it's psychological, and maybe the actor just needs to step out of their comfort zone? And if so, how do you recommend they do that?
Yeah, it's definitely our limiting thoughts that are getting in our own way. The beauty of the seed of any plant or anything like that is that it's hollow inside, yet all the innate intelligence of that plant will blossom into something that has leaves and flowers and bark and is a unique version of that plant in and of itself. It's all there. So it's really just our limiting thoughts that get in our own way from being able to ultimately be the artist that we want to be and share. And so part of the work I do as an on-camera audition technique teacher is giving that every person is just one audition away ever, and putting them in an opportunity where their feelings and their thoughts about the imperfections of this or that and the other don't get in their way. Because really, when we start feeling emotionally exposed, we're vulnerable, as Brene Brown says. And when we're vulnerable, we have the courage to create. And when we have the courage to create, we are the artists that we will ultimately be able to be. And we just don't know what it looks like, especially in auditioning for camera and film. You don't get that feedback of what that ended up looking like. And a lot of times you're so overwhelmed by the situation that you're even outside of your own body, which is potentially, it's a bad thing if it's out of just not being ready at all. But it could be a good thing because it gets you out of your own head and gets you out of your own limiting thoughts, potentially. It depends.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So I'd like to actually move into some questions about auditioning. I'd like to first actually start out with just as a coach who works with actors on their audition technique, what would be like 3 or a few more if you want, but like top recommendations for an actor to keep in mind for their auditioning work?
Well, it's the most unideal setup that you could have for acting in any form, the audition for camera. You're in a poorly painted room. It's a visual medium. It's not a language-based art form like theater. But yet at the same time, the camera's just on you basically from the chest up the whole time. There's never any cutaway to the reaction or the response to the other actor, or to a 2-shot of what's going on behind you, or establishing shots of where you're at. None of that. You don't have props. You don't have costumes. You got nothing but yourself and the visual things that you do, and your ability to act, to react, to listen. So bringing yourself at that moment, your life to bear, what's going on with you, your love for yourself, to the context of the scene is absolutely what I teach. And there's a lot that goes into that. The context of the scene stuff, understanding scene analysis, how the other person is affecting you, where you're at the end of the scene in regards to the relationship with that person, why and how that's changed, and all the little things that we don't pay attention to. We're always so initially consumed with our own lines, and I learned that from theater, where I'm counting my lines and this is how important I am and all the rest of that kind of stuff. And it's really the other person's lines that are moving you through the scene in that relationship. So, and really giving yourself the permission to tell that visual story, to be doing things that are instinctively, intuitively happening that don't necessarily make sense, because they don't in real life. And that's not how we're telling that story anyway. But allowing yourself the permission in that vulnerable state to be instinctive. And the issue that happens there, the limiting thoughts that happen there is that us as actors or us as people, we have developed ways to kind of win people over, right? And ways to compensate for the shames that have developed in us from past experience. And so the energy that goes into that puts these shells, these guards, these armors up for us. And the camera catches that as basically BS. And to actually recognize that that doesn't look weak, that actually looks, that there's not a meaning associated with being in that state that is adverse to you getting the role, is a huge experiential lesson that really can only happen in the context of working in front of the camera and seeing the results of that. So, and the other advice on auditioning, I would say, is that it really is never about getting the job. It's just about doing your job and learning what that is. So actors that I worked with just this last week, they've been cast from previous self-tapes, not from anything they're auditioning for right at that moment, and from live auditions that were not the show they were auditioning for. I mean, it literally happened to 2 different actresses this week for me. So going in there being like, this is the job I need to get. If I don't get this job and I don't do it the right way, the way I think the casting director would want it, and all that kind of meaning and story that we get, puts us in a place where we can't listen because we're culling from the past the whole way through the thing.
So you're saying that, I think what I'm hearing is like, you're, when an actor goes in for an audition, they should avoid like thinking about like, I need this job because of whatever, or I really want this job. They should more so be going in because like, this is going to be such a fun opportunity for me to play this character in this room and, you know, bring it to life. So
right. Yeah, because we're one focused as human beings right now. Right now, the 2 of us, where you're interviewing me and I'm being interviewed, and how I'm reacting to what you're asking me is based on what you're asking me. If I was thinking right now some other thing, like let's say this was a scene where there's an interview going on, but what Dave Bobb, is thinking right now is, will I get this job? There is no job. You're just interviewing me right now.
Yeah.
You know, so that just gets in the way.
That's very interesting. I think it's definitely like, I mean, you know, there's different statistics for everybody, but like, you know, obviously a portion of your auditions you're just kind of never gonna get. And I think that on top of being focused on the actual scene and not worrying about like, am I gonna get this job? Actors also need to remember that the audition itself is your job. You know, it's kind of like a freelancer who, you know, they think like let's say a photographer, they're like, oh, the actual job is when I'm taking pictures of the client. Well, as a freelancer, it's not. Your job is also like doing the scheduling with the client and sending out the photos and taking care of your tax papers and stuff. That's all part of the job. Whereas like an audition, booking the job is not really like booking your job. It's like, hey, I've gotten to it, you know, I'm doing something different within my job. The audition itself is kind of like part of your job as a freelance like actor. And you need to kind of be like, you know, I'm not just going into this audition. It's not like a random interview for a job. It is part of what I'm supposed to do on a day-to-day basis. And I have to enjoy playing this character and doing this audition for the sake of the audition itself, not for
well
like,
you don't necessarily have to enjoy it. I mean, situations that you're in any specific type of scene aren't necessarily enjoyable, but you do have to do your job regarding what the actor is responsible for that scene. But you're right, the job is the audition, which allows the casting director, despite whether or not you get chosen to be submitted for that, as one of the 6 submissions they send to the production, that work is, especially if it's a self-tape or just a taped audition that they keep in their vaults, is work that they can refer back to cast you in anything and everything else that they ever do for the rest of their life. And there have been actors that have stated that have been offered a role without auditioning for it 25 years after the last time they saw a casting director. And they're like, how on earth did you cast me in this? And they said, that performance blew me away, and I've always thought of you, and this has been the first project in which you were right for, so you never know how things go. It's really just all about planting seeds and seeing how they to go back to the seed from a different perspective, and allowing that to ultimately blossom when it does, with the patience and perseverance for us to just keep working on our personal and professional lives, because they're one and the same almost with this art form.
Yeah, I actually, before I move into my next question, I just want to kind of talk a little bit more about your idea of planting seeds. It reminds me of a book that I read. I think it was called The One-Page Marketing Plan. And it's a really good book. It's more about like marketing for business, but the author talks about how most business owners, freelancers, and, in our case, like even actors, they think of their career as hunting instead of farming. And so they're thinking like, I got to go out and find the project and respond to the audition and try to get in there and get the job right then and there. Whereas it's much better, like you're saying, that you want to plant all these seeds over time. And so you network with people and you just like keep people, keep yourself in their mind. And over time, like you plant hundreds of seeds and you don't ask people like immediately to hire you. You're more so like, hey, this is me, would love to keep in touch. And then you keep on refreshing their memory. And rather than like going out and trying to get one job after another and maybe only getting a job every few months, you set up and you set all these seeds, and maybe like 2 years later, you just start getting lots more than one job every 2 months. It's like a landslide of work. And I think I have to keep that in mind.
Yeah, that's great. It's really a great way to look at it. These casting directors, their jobs their reputations are on the line if they submit you and the production chooses you, and you haven't messed up and you are available on those dates and you get to set and then you totally fall apart, that's on the casting director. And so the audition is the entire experience of meeting them and them recognizing your level of readiness for standing in front of Robert De Niro or whoever it might be, or whatever director it might be, and doing your job on set as well, which is almost a different thing, art form even, though there's definitely crossover than auditioning for camera. So so it's all planting seeds and seeing how you're developing as they bring you in throughout the years, and giving them even more confidence and trust in who you are as an extension of their name.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to ask you a question. Well, first, there's this great book that I recently read through, and I recommend it to pretty much all the actors that I speak to. It's called How to Be a Working Actor by Mary Lynn Henry and Lynn Rogers. And it's almost like they call it like the Bible for actors. This is the 5th edition. It's been out, I think, since like the 80s or something. And it's the 80s or 90s, but it's crazy. Like she goes into like every possible detail from start to finish, from things like as simple as like how to find an apartment and pay your bills in places like New York and LA to, getting an agent and all that. Anyway, one of the things that she talks about relating to auditions is how Mary Lynn Henry is actually, like I interviewed her recently, and she's a casting director. And she was talking about the sound of your voice. I think the quote in the book is something along the lines of like how if you have a high-pitched or whiny or inaudible monotone voice, it's going to kind of announce an amateur actor. And so I was just curious on your thoughts about like voice training and how actors like actually need to really be in control of their voice when they go in for auditions.
Well, that's a tricky subject. Definitely voice work is extremely important in the theater world. I mean, the ability to project, to clearly enunciate, and to connect to really in the moment as you're saying these words, you're telling the story in theater. And if you were to be checking in on your voice, it'd be the same thing for film, for TV or film, for camera work. It'd be the same thing as checking in about, am I doing this audition well? Are they liking me? You know, am I going to get this role? Right now, during this interview, I don't think either of us, until right now, when we're talking about it, have been thinking about how their voice has been sounding. We've just been having a conversation. If you're going on a date with somebody, you're not checking in on how your voice sounds. And if you do, you're culling from the past and comparing. That being said, your voice will become more animated. It will have greater nuance when you're in it, you know, when you're alive, bringing yourself to the context of the scene, and will actually be deader if you're basically self-aware of yourself in the midst of the whole thing, and trying to use that energy of presence for instinctive, intuitive response to come through, for trying to modulate your voice in some way. So I would have to respectfully, extremely disagree with that when it comes to on-camera acting.
So it sounds like what you're saying, and I think that what she's saying as well, I wouldn't say, maybe I read it wrong, but she kind of proposes that actors definitely do need voice training. But I don't believe that she was saying, like, you know, you want to be consciously, like, constantly thinking about it during the audition. You know, you want to be fully present with your character and performance, but you need to have proper voice training to not have sort of, like, you know, voice issues where you're not pronouncing things clearly and all of that. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I would imagine to a certain extent that the vocal range of your voice could help you in an unconscious way. I mean, I'm telling you though, it's like with these lavaliers, these body mics, they're picking up everything. And I mean, if you watch the first season of True Detective, they're whispering, and they're like inaudible almost. And really, the lines aren't even how you're telling that story. The words, and if we hear it or not, that's it's almost like 10%, if that, of telling the story. It's a completely visual medium. You know, and when I say something to you, I'm checking in on how you physically react to it. That gets me the cues as to where I go next, especially when the camera's right on you. So, I mean, I guess to a certain extent, only having a specific range of vocal apparatus would, or if your voice is just stuck in, you know, my biggest issue with voice when I work with actors is, are they speaking from themselves? Are they really speaking with their voice? Very often we'll put something on our voice, just like we'll armor ourselves in some way as kind of a way to please others, because we're concerned about what we're about to say or the content of what we're doing. And so really just speaking from your voice, and to a certain extent some vocal work can help for that as well. Just kind
so
of
it sounds like, you know,
resonates.
you would both agree that the more training and the more understanding of your voice that you have, the better. Just as in anything, like the more you know about acting and being able to pull from different characters, the more techniques you have in your arsenal, the better, because it allows you to have more control. Whereas if you sort of like don't pay any attention to your voice, maybe they'll judge you, maybe not during the actual audition, but it's definitely limiting your performance capabilities.
Yeah, it would be similar to if you've hurt your shoulder because you're only using one of the 3 muscles that support your shoulder, and that puts you in a hunched over position. That learning where the shoulder naturally sits, the support that allows you to not hurt your shoulder anymore, will put you in basically a general place of being able to move your body more naturally in an unconscious fashion when you're
Yeah.
in the moment of a scene.
That's
Sure.
a perfect analogy. Thank you.
Yeah.
Awesome. So I have another question here. And again, I don't want to take up too much of your time, so we might be sort of coming to an end. But just in terms of the audition, I've heard a couple of times from casting directors and people in the industry who I've interviewed that in many cases, there's sort of like a feeling difference that a casting director will get. They might audition 20 people for a role, and they might have like 5 or 6 that they bring to a callback, something like that. And out of those few people, there's usually 1 or 2 that they see that like all of them were great, but there's just something different about those 1 or 2. And they've said like it gives them like goosebumps almost when they're watching the performance. And so my question for you is like, what's your opinion on that? Do you have any like thoughts as to what makes that difference there that really like, makes an actor stand out or give that person like this excitement feeling?
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. I mean, that's absolutely akin to when there's no note you could give the actor. That it's not how it was expected to go, but the story was completely told and in a completely unique fashion that had everything to do with that actor and what they brought to the table. And then the point being is that when a casting director gets a breakdown, they, the if there was a right way to do it, they could just find somebody to be a robot about it, right? And so it's this unique blend of the story and the specific unique human beings they're giving an opportunity to tell that story. And those that do it in a way that's authentic, that's integral to who they are, and that's creative in that moment while completely and still telling that story, are those that that are going to be indelible, that they can't not send. That being said, there's still so many parameters that you could have blown them away, like I said, and still not have them cast you for 25 years and still have done that. So it doesn't even mean that, I'm sure there are, of course, because there's unlimited possibilities in our world, there could be an actor that gave the best possible that acted the best possible way that any human being could have ever acted in the history of acting, and not only not gotten that job, but that led them to the despair of never auditioning again. But yeah, the more you can do your job as you learn how to define what that is, the better opportunity you have for that specific casting director to be affected in that way. And again, every casting director is different. Some aren't sensitive to that kind of stuff at all. Some are just not into what you have to offer the world. And so you could be doing that work and still it not be what they end up choosing as being the 6 that they send. That's why there's so many parameters to it all. But yeah, absolutely.
Cool. So I'd like to finish up by just asking you, is there anything else that you'd like to bring up? Anything that you would like to talk about that you think would be very helpful for actors to hear before we end this?
Well, I basically just work on word of mouth when it comes to the classes that I teach. You're welcome to go to davebobb.com to the class section, look at testimonials, and fill out a form if you're interested in working with me. I love it as much as I love acting at this point.
Well, I really appreciate your time. This was amazing. And thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you too.